They called him the ruthless Duke of Blackmere. They called him untouchable. They called him the Iron Spine of the Northern Territories, the man who crushed political rivals the way storms crushed fishing boats against the cliffs beneath his ancestral fortress. But on the morning his bride vanished without a single word, Cassian Raventhorn stood alone inside a cathedral-sized bedroom, staring at an empty ring on a marble table, and understood for the first time in his life that power could not stop a woman from walking away. What followed across the next 5 years broke him in ways no enemy ever managed. Stay with this story until the very last moment. The ending will change the way you understand everything that came before it. The engagement between Duke Cassian Raventhorn and Lady Seraphine Vale had been the most discussed alliance in the kingdom for 3 consecutive seasons, not because it was romantic, because it was inevitable. The Raventhorn dynasty controlled northern ports, trade corridors, military alliances, and enough parliamentary influence to reshape legislation over breakfast. The Vale family possessed ancient bloodlines, diplomatic connections across the southern provinces, and a reputation for producing women who could survive aristocratic warfare without flinching. Marriage between the 2 houses was not a union. It was a consolidation of territorial power dressed in white lace and wedding invitations. Seraphine understood this architecture from the beginning. She was not naive. She had watched her father negotiate her future the way he negotiated land acquisitions, with cold arithmetic and strategic patience. She accepted Cassian's proposal not because she loved him, but because she recognized something beneath the ruthlessness that intrigued her. A discipline that bordered on obsession, an intelligence that moved 3 steps ahead of every room he entered. And occasionally, in unguarded moments when he forgot to perform dominance, a vulnerability so carefully hidden it might as well have been classified. She spent 3 years learning the landscape of Blackmere, 3 years navigating his silences, his controlled fury, his terrifying ability to dismantle opponents without raising his voice. She studied him the way cartographers studied coastlines, tracing every edge, every dangerous current beneath the surface. And she had almost convinced herself that something real existed between them. Almost. The night before their wedding, Raventhorn Castle hummed with preparation. Servants polished silver until it bled light. Florists arranged arrangements so enormous they blocked entire hallways. The guest list read like a census of the kingdom's most powerful families. Everything was precisely calibrated to project Raventhorn grandeur. Seraphine could not sleep. She wandered the West Wing corridors in a simple dressing gown, her bare feet silent against the cold stone floors. She told herself she was restless from anticipation. She told herself the tightness in her chest was nerves, nothing more. But something pulled her forward. Some instinct older than reason. She heard voices before she reached the parlor, low, intimate, the kind of voices people use when they believe no one else exists. She stopped at the doorway. Candlelight threw long shadows across the room. Cassian stood near the fireplace with his back partially turned. Her younger sister Lyra pressed against him, both hands clutching the lapels of his coat, her face tilted upward with an expression Seraphine had never seen on her before. Desperation. Intimacy. Surrender. Cassian's hand was tangled in Lyra's hair. The image burned itself into Seraphine's memory with surgical precision. Every detail, the angle of his wrist, the way Lyra's fingers trembled against the dark fabric, the firelight catching the moisture on her sister's lower lip. Seraphine did not scream. She did not cry. She did not storm into the room demanding explanations like some wounded creature begging for scraps of dignity. Instead, something inside her went quiet, not peaceful. Quiet the way a house goes quiet after everyone inside has already left. A silence that meant the person who lived there no longer existed. She returned to her chambers. She dressed in traveling clothes. She packed one small bag containing nothing of value except practicality. She removed the Raventhorn engagement ring, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds worth more than most estates, and placed it on the marble entrance table beneath the towering family crest. Then she walked into the freezing rain and disappeared. No note, no confrontation, no farewell. She simply ceased to be Lady Seraphine Vale, and the woman who replaced her had no intention of ever being found. Cassian discovered her absence at dawn. The ring sat on the marble like an accusation. He stood over it for 11 minutes without moving. His valet confirmed this later under direct questioning, though the man's hand shook while describing the Duke's face during those minutes. Not anger, not confusion. Something worse. The expression of a man watching the ground open beneath him and choosing to stand perfectly still while he fell. Then Cassian Raventhorn became something the kingdom had never witnessed before. He became desperate. Within hours, every road leaving Blackmere territory was blocked. Riders carried his orders across 3 provinces before nightfall. Port authorities received sealed communications demanding passenger manifests for every vessel departing the northern coast. Servants were questioned individually in closed rooms. Guards were reassigned. Investigators were hired, dismissed, replaced, and hired again. He interrogated Lyra personally. The conversation happened behind locked doors inside his private study, and the only account of it came from a footman stationed in the corridor who reported hearing Lyra sobbing so violently the sound carried through oak panels 3 inches thick. But Cassian emerged from that room with nothing useful. Whatever Lyra told him, it did not produce Seraphine's location. It did not undo the damage. It did not fill the silence she had carved into Raventhorn Castle like a wound that refused to close. Weeks became months, months became seasons, seasons became years. The Duke of Blackmere continued to rule. He attended parliamentary sessions. He managed trade disputes. He crushed a minor rebellion in the eastern provinces with characteristic efficiency. Outwardly, nothing changed. The kingdom still feared him. Lords still measured their words twice in his presence. The Raventhorn name still controlled half the political alliances that mattered. But those closest to him noticed differences. He stopped attending social functions unless politics demanded it. He dismissed his personal staff twice and rehired them without explanation. He spent long hours in the West Wing parlor where the incident had occurred, though servants reported finding nothing disturbed except the candles, which he burned constantly until the room permanently smelled of wax and something darker. His steward, a man named Hargrove, who had served 3 generations of Raventhorns, once described the change to a trusted colleague with uncharacteristic bluntness. He used to be ruthless because he enjoyed it. Now he is ruthless because he has forgotten how to be anything else. 5 years after Seraphine vanished, Cassian received intelligence from a private investigator he had kept on permanent retainer. A woman matching her description had been identified in a remote coastal village called Thornhaven, 300 miles south of Blackmere. She was teaching children to read. She used the name Elise Marin. She had 2 sons. The investigator's report was 12 pages long. Cassian read it once. Then he ordered his carriage prepared for immediate departure. Thornhaven existed at the edge of geography, where the land surrendered to the sea and forgot about civilization. Salt crusted every window, paint peeled from every building. Fishing boats rocked in the harbor like tired old men nodding off after too much drink. The village survived on cod, silence, and a collective distrust of anyone arriving from inland. The black carriage bearing the Raventhorn insignia rolled into the village square on an autumn morning when the fog sat so thick against the cliffs it looked like the sky had collapsed. Every fisherman in the harbor stopped working. Every woman near the market stalls went quiet. Children pressed their faces against cottage windows. A carriage like that did not belong in Thornhaven. It belonged to a different world entirely. A world of marble floors and political violence and men who owned more land than most people would ever see in a lifetime. Cassian stepped onto the cobblestones wearing a black traveling coat that cost more than every boat in the harbor combined. His boots hit the wet stone with a sound that carried across the square like a verdict. He looked exactly like what he was. A man who had torn apart 5 years of silence and traveled 300 miles to stand in a village that smelled like fish and fog and confront the only defeat of his entire life. He found the schoolhouse on the cliff path overlooking the sea, a small stone building with a blue wooden door and windows so old the glass warped the light. He could hear children's voices inside. Laughter, the patient rhythm of someone teaching. He opened the door without knocking, because Cassian Raventhorn had never knocked on a door in his life and was not about to start in a fishing village. The room fell silent. 8 children sat on wooden benches with slate tablets balanced on their knees. Chalk dust floated in the gray light. The walls were lined with hand-drawn maps and illustrations of sea creatures labeled in careful handwriting. The air smelled like rain, old books, and something clean that had nothing to do with wealth. Seraphine stood at the front of the room. She was thinner than he remembered, stronger in a way that had nothing to do with physical size. Her hair was pulled back simply. Her dress was plain, dark fabric without ornamentation. Her hands were stained with chalk. She looked like a woman who had rebuilt herself from raw materials and owed nothing to anyone. Their eyes met. 5 years collapsed into a single breath. Seraphine's expression did not change, not visibly, but something shifted behind her eyes, a recognition that traveled deeper than surprise. The kind of recognition that meant she had imagined this moment 1,000 times and still was not prepared for it. "Children," she said calmly, without breaking eye contact with Cassian. "Class is finished early today. Please take your tablets home and practice your letters." The children filed out in confused silence, several of them staring up at the tall stranger in the black coat with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright fear. When the last child disappeared through the door, Seraphine did not move. Neither did Cassian. The silence between them was not empty. It was loaded, dense, the kind of silence that contained entire conversations neither of them was willing to start. Cassian spoke first. "You made yourself very difficult to find. That was the point." 5 years, Seraphine. "Elise. My name is Elise here. Your name is Seraphine Vale, and you are standing in a schoolhouse that smells like fish, while half the kingdom believes you drowned yourself in the Northern Sea." Let them believe it. He took one step forward. She did not retreat. That single detail told him more about the woman she had become than 5 years of investigation reports. "You left without a word," he said, "without an explanation, without giving me the chance to what?" Her voice cut across his like a blade drawn cleanly from a sheath. "To explain? To justify? To perform whatever version of regret you had prepared for the occasion? To tell you the truth. I saw the truth. Your hand in my sister's hair. Her body pressed against yours the night before you were supposed to stand beside me and swear loyalty in front of 600 people." Seraphine's jaw tightened. "I did not need a translation. You needed to stay long enough to hear one. And you needed to keep your hands off my sister." The words landed between them like something dropped from a great height. Cassian's expression did not crack, but something behind it rearranged itself. A flinch buried so deep only someone who had spent 3 years studying his face would have recognized it. "What you saw that night was not what you believed it was. Every man caught in the wrong room with the wrong woman says exactly that. Your sister came to me in panic. She had discovered the financial arrangement between our families. Your father's estate was collapsing. He had structured our marriage as a transaction to save himself from ruin. Lyra found the documents. She was terrified you would learn the truth and call off the engagement, which would have destroyed your family completely." Seraphine went very still. "She was crying," Cassian continued, his voice dropping to a register that sounded nothing like command. "She grabbed my coat because she was falling apart. I held her head because she was hyperventilating against my chest, and I did not know what else to do. I am not a man who comforts people well, Seraphine. I never have been. What you witnessed was clumsiness, not betrayal." The room became so quiet they could hear the sea crashing against the cliffs below. "You expect me to believe that. I expect you to consider it. After 5 years. Would you have believed me 5 years ago?" The question hit something she had not fortified against, because the honest answer was no. 5 years ago she had been too wounded, too proud, too convinced of her own interpretation to hear anything that contradicted what her eyes had recorded. She had made her decision in the space between one heartbeat and the next, and she had built an entire life on top of that decision. Admitting it might have been wrong was not the same as regretting the life she had built, but it changed the architecture of her anger in ways she was not prepared to examine. "Why are you here, Cassian?" "Because I have been looking for you every single day since you disappeared. Because I hired 14 investigators across 5 years and fired 12 of them for incompetence. Because I have spent more money searching for one woman than I have spent on any political campaign in my career. Because I could not—" He stopped himself. The pause was more revealing than anything he had said. Cassian Raventhorn did not pause. He did not hesitate. He did not leave sentences unfinished. The man who controlled kingdoms and crushed rivals without blinking stood inside a chalk-dusted schoolhouse and could not complete his own thought. Could not what? Seraphine asked quietly. Could not accept that you were gone. Outside, the wind changed direction. Salt air pushed through the warped windows. Somewhere below the cliffs, fishing boats creaked against their moorings. Seraphine studied him the way she had studied him years ago, searching for performance beneath the surface, looking for the angle, the calculation, the strategic maneuvering that defined everything Cassian Raventhorn touched. She found something else instead. Exhaustion. Not physical. Something deeper. The kind of weariness that settled into a person's bones when they had been carrying something too heavy for too long without anyone to help bear the weight. You should not have come here, she said finally. This place has nothing for a man like you. This place has you. The woman you knew does not exist anymore. Then I will learn the woman who replaced her. Before Seraphine could respond, the schoolhouse door burst open. Two boys tumbled inside with the chaotic energy of children who had been running at full speed and could not figure out how to stop. They were roughly 4 years old, dark-haired, wild with the kind of fearless momentum that belonged to creatures raised near the sea. The first boy, slightly taller and watchful, stopped immediately when he saw the stranger. His gray eyes, pale and sharp as winter light, fixed on Cassian with an intensity that did not belong to a child his age. The second boy crashed directly into his brother's backs, stumbled forward, looked up at Cassian and grinned with the unearned confidence of someone who had never met a situation he could not charm his way through. Seraphine's face changed completely. Not anger, not defiance. Terror. The kind of terror that lived in the space between a secret and its discovery. Cassian looked at the boys. Then he looked at Seraphine. Then he looked at the boys again. Gray eyes. Raventhorn gray. The exact shade that had stared back at him from every mirror since childhood. The same color that ran through 6 generations of his bloodline, like a signature written in storm clouds. The taller boy studied Cassian with the same analytical stillness Cassian himself used when evaluating an opponent across a negotiation table. "Mama," the boy said carefully, "who is that man?" Seraphine did not answer, because the truth was standing right in front of her, wearing a black coat and an expression she had never seen on the Duke of Blackmere before. Cassian's hands, the same hands that had signed execution orders and destroyed political dynasties, were shaking. And for the first time in 5 years, Seraphine realized that disappearing had not been the cruelest thing she had done to him. Keeping his children a secret was. Cassian's hands would not stop shaking. He had commanded warships through winter storms without flinching. He had signed documents that ended political careers while drinking morning tea. He had watched men beg for mercy across negotiation tables and felt nothing except the cold satisfaction of leverage properly applied. But standing inside a schoolhouse that smelled like chalk and sea salt, staring at 2 small boys who carried his bloodline in the gray of their eyes, the Duke of Blackmere could not control his own fingers. The taller boy had not moved. He stood between Cassian and his brother with a stillness that did not belong to a 4-year-old, his body angled slightly forward, not aggressive, but watchful, the posture of someone who had already learned that strangers required evaluation before trust. The smaller boy peered around his brother's shoulder with unguarded curiosity, his dark hair wild from wind and his cheeks flushed from running. Seraphine stepped forward and placed herself between Cassian and the children with the precision of a woman who had rehearsed this nightmare 1,000 times. "Lucienne, Elias, go to Mrs. Corrigan's cottage. Tell her I will collect you before supper." "But Mama, shh. Now, Lucienne." The boy heard something in her voice that arguments could not override. He took his brother's hand, gave Cassian one final measuring look that was so purely Raventhorn it felt like being examined by his own reflection, and led Elias out of the schoolhouse without another word. The door closed behind them. The silence that followed was not silence at all. It was pressure, the kind that builds behind a dam moments before the structure fails. Cassian spoke first, and his voice sounded like it had been dragged across gravel. "How old are they?" "You already know the answer to that. Say it." 4 years and 3 months. The math was simple, brutal. The timeline placed conception during the final weeks of their engagement, During the period when Seraphine had still believed she was building a future with him, when their intimacy had been real and unguarded and carrying the full weight of what they both assumed would become a marriage. Cassian turned away from her. He walked to the window and pressed both hands flat against the stone sill. Outside, fog swallowed the cliff edge and the sea below was invisible, reduced to sound alone, a constant, rhythmic violence against rock. You kept my sons from me. I kept my sons safe. From what? From their father? From the protection of the most powerful house in the Northern Territories? From a name that would have guaranteed them from you. Seraphine's voice did not waver. From the machine you operate. From the world that would have turned them into instruments before they learned to walk. You do not get to make that decision alone. I made every decision alone. For 5 years. Every fever, every nightmare, every winter when the money ran thin and I had to choose between firewood and food. I made those decisions alone because you were in a castle 300 miles away with your hand in my sister's hair. I told you what happened that night. And I told you the truth arrives 5 years too late to matter. Cassian turned from the window. His face had rearranged itself into something controlled again, the mask reassembled, but imperfectly. Cracks showed at the edges. His jaw was set so tight the muscles along his neck stood visible beneath the skin. Their names, he said, Lucien and Elias. Lucien. He repeated the name slowly, testing its weight. The quiet one. He reads everything he can find. He remembers conversations from months ago and asks questions about them at breakfast. He does not trust easily, and he does not forgive quickly. Something shifted in Cassian's expression, recognition, the uncomfortable kind. And Elias? Elias is afraid of nothing. He climbed onto a fishing boat last summer and sailed 300 yards into the harbor before anyone noticed. He talks to strangers. He laughs too loudly. He believes every problem can be solved by moving faster. He sounds reckless. He sounds like you. Before whatever happened to you made you decide that control was the only thing worth having. That landed somewhere Cassian had not fortified. His breath changed, just barely, the kind of shift only visible to someone standing close enough to count heartbeats. He crossed the room in 3 strides and stopped close enough to Seraphine that she could smell the leather of his traveling coat and the particular scent that had never changed, iron and cedar, and something cold beneath it, like winter stored inside a man. I want to know them. You do not get to want things from me anymore. This is not about you. This is about 2 boys growing up without knowing who they are. They know exactly who they are. They are Lucien and Elias Marin. They belong to Thornhaven. They belong to this life. They belong to Blackmere. They have never seen Blackmere. They have never heard the name Raventhorn, and they have survived perfectly well without either. Survived. Cassian repeated the word like it offended him. You are describing survival as though it is the same thing as living. For some of us, survival is all there is. Not everyone gets to choose between luxury and legacy, Cassian. Some of us are too busy keeping children fed. He flinched. A real one this time, visible and ungoverned, and Seraphine watched it happen with the detached precision of a woman who had spent 5 years converting pain into armor. I did not know, he said, because I did not want you to know. That was not your right. And marrying me for my father's debts was not yours. The accusation shifted the ground between them completely. Cassian went still, the particular kind of still that preceded either violence or revelation. And with Cassian, the distance between the two had always been measured in millimeters. You know about the financial arrangement. Your version of it, Lyra discovering documents, my father's collapsing estate, the entire marriage structured as a rescue operation disguised as romance. Seraphine's voice dropped into something quieter but infinitely more dangerous. Tell me, Cassian, at what point during our 3-year engagement were you planning to mention that you were purchasing me? That is not what happened. Then what would you call it? Your father approached me, not the reverse. His debts were catastrophic. He needed Raventhorn capital to prevent complete ruin. The marriage was his condition, not mine. His condition. I agreed because it served my interest politically. I will not pretend otherwise. But the arrangement and my feelings were not the same thing, Seraphine. They existed on separate ground. How convenient for you. Two separate truths that never had to reconcile because you made sure I never knew about either one. Cassian's jaw worked beneath the skin. He had no defense against this, and they both knew it. The omission was real. The architecture of their engagement had contained a hidden floor, and Seraphine had been walking across it for 3 years without knowing what lay beneath. "I should have told you," he said finally. "Yes. I calculated that the information would cause unnecessary damage." "You calculated?" A thin smile crossed Seraphine's face, sharp and mirthless. "There it is. The Raventhorn method. Reduce every human interaction to risk assessment. Manage the variables. Control the outcome. And when the outcome collapses anyway, spend 5 years treating the wreckage like a problem to be solved instead of a person to be mourned. I mourned you. You hunted me. Those are not the same thing." The distinction cut deep enough to draw blood from the conversation itself. Cassian stepped back. One step. The physical retreat was so uncharacteristic that Seraphine registered it the way she would register a crack appearing in a fortress wall. Something fundamental was shifting inside the structure. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want to know my sons." "And then what? Take them? Install them in Blackmere Castle? Train them into little replicas of the Raventhorn legacy? Give them tutors and titles and teach them that power is the only currency that matters? You assume the worst of me. You taught me to." Cassian closed his eyes for 3 seconds. When he opened them, something had been stripped away. Not the authority, not the control. Something older. A pretense he had been maintaining so long it had fused to his skin, and removing it left raw tissue exposed. "I am asking," he said, "not commanding, not demanding, not leveraging. I am asking you to let me meet my children as their father, not as the Duke of Blackmere, not as a title or a threat, as the man whose blood runs through them." Seraphine studied him for a long time. The wind picked up outside. The schoolhouse windows rattled in their frames. Below the cliffs, the sea threw itself against stone with the patience of something that had been breaking things since before humans existed. "One evening," she said, "you come to the cottage. You sit with them. You do not mention Blackmere. You do not mention titles, inheritance, or anything connected to the life I left behind. You are a friend visiting from the city, that is all. You want me to lie to them. I want you to earn the right to tell them the truth. One evening, Cassian. Take it or leave." He took it. The cottage where Seraphine lived sat at the end of a narrow lane that dead-ended at a stone wall overlooking the harbor. It was small enough that Cassian had to duck through the front door. The furniture was worn but clean. A fire burned in a hearth barely large enough to heat the room. Books lined shelves that had been built from salvaged ship timber. The whole space carried the evidence of a life assembled carefully from limited resources by a woman who refused to let scarcity become an excuse for carelessness. The boys were already inside when Cassian arrived. Elias noticed him first. The boy launched off his chair with the aerodynamic enthusiasm of a small projectile and stopped 3 feet away, staring upward with an expression that combined intense evaluation with absolute fearlessness. "You are very tall," Elias announced. "I am," Cassian agreed. "Are you taller than Captain Brennan? He is the tallest man in Thornhaven. He caught a fish bigger than me once." "I have never met Captain Brennan, so I cannot say." "I bet you are taller. You look taller. Do you catch fish?" "I do not." "What do you do?" Cassian glanced at Seraphine, who stood near the hearth with her arms crossed, and an expression that offered him exactly 0 assistance. "I manage property," Cassian said carefully. "That sounds boring." "It frequently is." Elias considered this, found it acceptable, and immediately pivoted to the next subject with the conversational agility of someone who had never encountered an awkward silence in his life. "Do you want to see my boat? I made it from a piece of wood I found on the beach. Mama helped me with the sail, but I did the rest." "I would like to see it very much." Elias disappeared into the next room at full speed. Lucien had not moved from his seat. The older twin sat at a small table with a book open in front of him, though he had not turned a page since Cassian entered. His gray eyes tracked the Duke with the careful patience of a boy who understood that watching told you more than asking. Cassian sat in the chair across from him. Your mother tells me you like to read. Yes. What are you reading? Lucian turned the book so Cassian could see the cover. A maritime atlas, old and water-stained, filled with maps of coastlines and shipping routes. Do you understand the navigation charts? Cassian asked. Some of them. The symbols for depth are confusing. Fathom markings. They measure the distance from the surface to the seabed. The numbers decrease as you approach shallow water. Sailors used them to avoid running aground. Lucien looked at him with the first flicker of genuine interest. How do you know that? Blackmere, the estate I manage, sits above sea cliffs. I learned to read nautical charts before I learned to read legal documents. Is Blackmere near the ocean? Very near, the northern coast. The water is colder than here, and the cliffs are higher. How high? High enough that you can see 3 islands from the top on clear days. Lucien absorbed this with visible hunger. The boy was starving for information the way some children starved for affection, quietly, without complaint, in a way that made the deprivation easy to overlook. I would like to see cliffs that high, Lucien said. Perhaps you will someday. Seraphine's eyes sharpened from across the room. A warning. Cassian registered it without acknowledgement and changed direction. Tell me about the depth symbols that confuse you. Show me which ones. Lucien turned the atlas toward him and pointed, and for the next 20 minutes the Duke of Blackmere sat inside a fisherman's cottage explaining maritime cartography to a 4-year-old boy who listened with the concentration of a scholar twice his age. Elias returned with his boat, which was roughly the shape of an actual vessel, in the same way that a cloud is roughly the shape of a castle, and spent the remainder of the evening demonstrating its seaworthiness inside a wash basin while providing continuous narration of imaginary naval battles. When Cassian finally knelt beside both boys to say goodnight, something cracked inside his chest that he had not known was still capable of breaking. Elias hugged him without hesitation, the way children hug people they have decided to trust based on evidence invisible to adults. Lucien offered his hand for a handshake, small fingers gripping with formal precision, and looked directly into Cassian's eyes with an expression that said, I am still deciding about you. Cassian shook his hand solemnly. Then he stood, and the room felt smaller, and the fire felt insufficient, and the entire world outside this cottage felt like an obstacle designed to keep him away from the 2 people he had only just discovered mattered more than everything he had spent his life building. Seraphine walked him to the door. They are extraordinary, he said. They are children. They do not need to be extraordinary. They need to be safe. I can give them both. You can give them one. Safety is not something that exists inside the world you control, Cassian. It is something that exists in its absence. He looked at her for a long time. The woman standing in the doorway of a fisherman's cottage bore almost no resemblance to the lady he had been engaged to marry 5 years ago. That woman had been polished, strategic, armored in social grace. This woman was harder, leaner, built from different materials entirely, and somehow infinitely more dangerous to him because she no longer needed anything he could offer. I will be at the inn on the harbor, he said. I am not leaving Thornhaven. I did not expect you to. Tomorrow, same arrangement. I come to the cottage. I sit with them. I earn the right. We will see. Seraphine. Cassian. I am not the same man you left. Prove it. He walked into the night without answering, because proving it was exactly what he intended to do, and promises spoken aloud had always been the cheapest currency in his vocabulary. What Cassian did not know as he crossed the dark lane toward the harbor was that his arrival in Thornhaven had already sent information traveling faster than he could control. The village postmaster, a man named Haddock, who supplemented his income by selling information to anyone willing to pay for it, had recognized the Raventhorn crest on the carriage within minutes of its arrival. By nightfall, a letter was already traveling by overnight courier toward the northern provinces. The recipient was Lord Malric Thornfield, Cassian's first cousin, and the man who currently stood next in the Raventhorn line of succession. Malric had spent 5 years positioning himself as Cassian's inevitable heir. He had cultivated political alliances, secured financial backing, and quietly assembled a network of supporters who understood that a duke without children was a duke whose legacy had an expiration date. Every investment Malric had made, every favor he had traded, every promise he had extracted from nervous lords hedging their bets. All of it was built on the assumption that Cassian Raventhorn would die without producing an heir. Two boys in a fishing village just detonated the foundation of that entire architecture. Malric received the postmaster's letter at his estate 40 miles south of Blackmere. At approximately the same hour, Cassian was sitting on a cottage floor, learning about imaginary sea monsters from a 4-year-old. He read it twice. Then he summoned his solicitor, his personal secretary, and the political operative he kept on private retainer for situations that required solutions existing outside the boundaries of legal convention. The meeting lasted until dawn. By morning, 3 separate strategies were in motion. The first targeted the legitimacy of the children through succession law. The second targeted Seraphine's reputation through coordinated whisper campaigns among noble families. The third was quieter, more personal, and aimed directly at the fragile trust forming between a father who had just discovered his sons and a mother who had spent 5 years making sure he never would. Malric Thornfield was not a man who panicked. He was a man who dismantled threats methodically, the same way a surgeon removes a tumor, with precision, patience, and absolute willingness to cut whatever needed cutting. And 2 illegitimate children standing between him and the most powerful duchy in the kingdom needed to be cut immediately. Back in Thornhaven, Seraphine locked the cottage door, checked that both boys were sleeping, and sat alone at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour ago. She was shaking, not from fear, from the particular kind of exhaustion that follows sustained performance, the collapse that comes when you finally stop pretending you are not terrified. Because she had watched Cassian kneel beside her sons tonight. She had watched the most dangerous man she had ever known fold himself onto a cottage floor and explain fathom markings to a 4-year-old with a patience she did not know he possessed. She had watched Elias climb into his lap without hesitation and Lucien offer him a handshake with the gravity of a diplomat. And she had seen something on Cassian's face that she had spent 5 years telling herself did not exist. The capacity to be changed by love instead of destroyed by it. And that terrified her more than his anger ever had. Because anger she could fight. Control she could resist. Domination she could flee. But a man willing to sit on a dirty floor and listen to a child talk about imaginary sea monsters, a man whose hands shook when he realized what he had lost, a man who asked instead of commanded because a woman in a fishing village told him to earn the right. That man was harder to walk away from. And somewhere north of this village, in a stone estate surrounded by men who measured human beings in terms of political utility, Seraphine's worst fear was already assembling itself into the kind of threat that no amount of distance could outrun. The sea crashed against the cliffs below Thornhaven with the same indifferent rhythm it had maintained for 10,000 years. It did not care about dukes or mothers or sleeping children. It simply continued, the way destruction always does, patient and relentless and utterly unconcerned with the fragile things built along its edges. Malric Thornfield arrived in Thornhaven 11 days after Cassian. He came without the family crest, without livery, without anything that connected him visibly to the Raventhorn bloodline or the political machinery grinding behind his smile. He rode in a hired coach, wore a traveling suit cut to suggest prosperous merchant rather than aristocratic predator, and checked into the harbor inn under the name Mr. Aldrich Marsh with the relaxed manner of a man visiting the coast for his health. The innkeeper noticed nothing unusual. The fisherman noticed nothing unusual. Seraphine noticed nothing at all, because she was standing on the cliff path watching Cassian teach Lucien to identify seabirds by their flight patterns, while Elias threw pebbles at the waves below with the accuracy of a child who believed every rock deserved to reach the ocean. 11 days had changed things, not dramatically, not the way Cassian would have preferred with decisive resolution and clear terms established, but slowly, the way coastlines change, through constant pressure applied with patience that did not come naturally to a man accustomed to controlling outcomes through force. He came to the cottage every evening. He sat on the floor. He learned that Lucien organized his book collection by subject and became silently furious when anyone disturbed the order. He learned that Elias talked in his sleep, narrating adventures that involved sea creatures of impossible scale. He learned that both boys ate bread with butter and honey before bed, and that Lucien always tore his into precise squares while Elias consumed his in 3 bites regardless of size. He learned what fatherhood smelled like: soap and salt air, and the particular warmth that rose from a child's hair after a day spent running. And he learned something about himself that 5 years of ruling Blackmere had never revealed. That the version of Cassian Raventhorn who existed inside this cottage, the one who sat cross-legged on worn floorboards explaining tidal patterns to a boy who listened like the information might save his life someday, was not a diminished version of the Duke. He was the version that had been locked inside the fortress all along, suffocating behind walls built to keep power in and everything else out. Seraphine watched this transformation with the wariness of a woman who had been wrong about this man before and understood the cost of being wrong again. She allowed the visits. She permitted conversations. She did not leave the room when Cassian was with the boys, and she did not soften the boundaries she had established. But she stopped bracing every time he walked through the door. And Cassian noticed. On the 11th morning, Malric walked the cliff path with a walking stick he did not need and a surveyor's eye for human behavior. He located the schoolhouse. He identified the cottage. He observed from sufficient distance that Cassian would not detect his presence, which was considerable distance indeed given the Duke's trained awareness of his surroundings. But Malric had studied Cassian for 30 years. He knew the man's blind spots the way a locksmith knows tumblers. And Cassian's blind spot had always been the same. He could not conceive of betrayal from blood. Family, in the Raventhorn doctrine, was the one alliance that superseded politics. It was the single covenant the old Duke had drilled into both Cassian and Malric since boyhood, the foundational law that everything else was built upon. You could betray a business partner. You could betray a political ally. You could even betray the crown if survival demanded it. But you did not betray family. Cassian still believed this. Malric had stopped believing it the day he calculated the exact value of the Blackmere Duchy and subtracted his own inheritance from the total. The difference was worth more than loyalty. The difference was worth more than anything. On the 12th day, Malric made his first move. He introduced himself to Seraphine at the village market. She was purchasing fish and winter vegetables from a stall near the harbor. The boys were at the schoolhouse with a local woman Seraphine employed as an assistant on mornings she needed to manage household errands. The market was crowded enough that a stranger initiating conversation was unremarkable. Malric approached with the careful warmth of a man who understood that trust was not given but constructed, one credible gesture at a time. "Pardon the intrusion. I could not help noticing you seem to know this village well. I am visiting for several weeks and find myself entirely lost regarding which fishmonger can be trusted." Seraphine glanced at him. A merchant. Well-dressed but not extravagantly. Polite without being aggressive. She pointed him toward Brennan's stall and returned to her purchase. But Malric had not come for fish. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. Each time with a question slightly more personal than the last. Each time with a demeanor so carefully calibrated to feel accidental that even a woman who had survived 5 years on instinct did not detect the engineering beneath it. By the fourth encounter, they were having actual conversations. Malric was intelligent, disarmingly so. He discussed books with genuine knowledge. He asked about the schoolhouse with what appeared to be authentic interest. He mentioned nothing about aristocracy, wealth, or the North. He presented himself as a man of modest means with intellectual curiosity and the kind of gentle self-deprecation that made powerful people seem harmless. On the 5th morning, he mentioned children. "I noticed the school on the cliff, a beautiful location. Do you teach there?" "I do." "Your own children attend as well?" "My sons, yes. They help with the younger students sometimes." "2 sons. That must keep you remarkably busy as a single mother." The observation was precise, sympathetic, and it opened a door that Malric had been patiently constructing for 5 days. Seraphine did not walk through it. Not entirely. But she did not close it either, and that inch of space was all Malric needed. He spent the following week building the architecture of manufactured trust. He encountered the boys once, at the harbor, and was careful to be warm without being intrusive. Elias, predictably, began talking to him within 30 seconds. Lucien watched from a distance with his usual evaluative silence. Malric told Seraphine he was a former teacher himself, that he had worked with children in the eastern provinces, that he understood the particular exhaustion of educating young minds with limited resources. Every word was a lie, delivered with the craftsmanship of a man who understood that the best deceptions were built from materials the target wanted to believe. And Seraphine, who had spent 5 years defending herself against the obvious threats, against discovery, against poverty, against the Raventhorn name itself, did not recognize the threat that arrived disguised as kindness. Because cruelty wearing a familiar face is dangerous, but cruelty wearing a stranger's sympathy is invisible. Cassian first saw Malric on the 17th day. He was walking the harbor road toward the cottage for his evening visit when he spotted a figure sitting on the stone wall outside Seraphine's door, speaking with Elias. The man's back was turned. His posture was relaxed. Elias was laughing, demonstrating something with his hands, while the man listened with the attentive patience of someone genuinely interested. Cassian's stride did not break, but something inside his chest locked into a configuration he recognized from decades of political combat. The sensation was not thought. It was older than thought. The animal recognition that something in the environment had changed, and the change carried danger. He rounded the wall and saw Malric's face. The world stopped making the kind of sense that permitted rational response. Malric looked up, smiled. A warm, convincing smile that carried no trace of the calculation behind it. Cassian. What an extraordinary coincidence. The Duke did not speak. He stood in the lane with the harbor wind cutting against his coat and looked at his cousin sitting outside Seraphine's cottage, talking to his son, and felt something rearrange itself inside his body with the slow, grinding precision of tectonic plates shifting before an earthquake. Elias, Cassian said without moving his eyes from Malric, go inside. Now. The boy heard the tone, not anger directed at him, but something underneath the voice that children recognize instinctively, the sound of an adult preparing for something they do not want witnessed. Elias glanced between the two men, confusion flickering across his face, then disappeared through the cottage door. The two men stood alone in the lane. Salt wind, creaking boats, the distant percussion of waves on rock. You should not be here, Cassian said. A man cannot visit the coast? A man can visit whatever coast he chooses. My cousin visiting this particular coast at this particular time is not coincidence, and we both know it. So I will ask you once. Why are you here? Malric stood from the wall with the unhurried ease of someone who had anticipated this conversation and prepared for it the way generals prepare for engagement, with contingencies layered behind contingencies. I am here because you disappeared from Blackmere without explanation. Your steward would not say where you had gone. Your staff was instructed to refuse all inquiries. When a duke abandons his estate without notice, his family has reason to be concerned. Your concern is noted and unwanted. My concern extends beyond sentiment, Cassian. I have obligations to the Raventhorn succession, legal obligations. If you have discovered something here that affects the bloodline, I have a right to know. You have no rights in this village. I have rights wherever Raventhorn interests are at stake. The two men looked at each other with the kind of stillness that precedes either negotiation or violence. Malric's expression shifted, subtle. A recalibration of approach that someone less familiar with his methods might have missed entirely. The warmth drained away like tide retreating from a beach, exposing the harder surface beneath. I know about the children, Cassian. Silence. I know their ages. I know their mother. I know the timeline matches your engagement to Lady Vale 5 years ago. And I know that if they are yours, everything I have built over the past 5 years becomes worthless. Cassian's voice dropped to a register that the courts of Blackmere associated with imminent political destruction. Choose your next words very carefully. I choose them with absolute precision. You have 2 unrecognized children born outside of marriage to a woman who fled your household under scandalous circumstances. The succession implications are considerable. The legal challenges are considerable. The political exposure is considerable. And you are standing in a fishing village 300 miles from the people and resources you need to manage any of it. I am standing exactly where I choose to stand. And that is exactly your problem. Malric stepped closer. His voice maintained the same measured control, but something beneath it had teeth. You are thinking like a father. You need to be thinking like a duke, because the moment those boys' existence becomes public knowledge, Every noble family in the kingdom will have an opinion about Raventhorn's succession, and not all of those opinions will favor you. Let me tell you what will happen if you interfere with my children. Your children. That is precisely the claim that will be contested, loudly, publicly, in tribunals where sentiment carries no weight and bloodline must be proven through documentation, not emotion. You would challenge the legitimacy of your own blood? I would protect my position, the same way you have protected yours for 30 years, the same way every Raventhorn has protected theirs for 6 generations. We are not a family that pretends power operates on affection, Cassian. We are a family that understands power operates on law. Cassian closed the distance between them. He did not touch Malric. He did not need to. The proximity alone carried the weight of everything the Raventhorn name meant when it was directed at a single target. If you go near those boys again, Cassian said, his voice barely above a whisper, I will dismantle you. Not your career, not your finances, not your political connections. You. Everything you have constructed, everything you believe protects you, everything you think you understand about the boundaries of what I am willing to do. I will take it apart piece by piece until there is nothing left to identify. Malric held his ground, but his breathing changed, a slight acceleration that betrayed the biological truth beneath his composure. Threats are the refuge of men who have run out of strategy. That is not a threat. That is a promise delivered face to face as a courtesy I will not extend twice. Cassian turned and walked into the cottage without looking back. Inside, Seraphine was standing at the kitchen table with Lucien and Elias behind her. Her body was positioned between the door and the children with the instinctive geometry of a mother who had heard the tone of the conversation outside and already calculated the threat. "Who is that man?" she asked. "My cousin, Lord Malric Thornfield." "Your cousin?" "He is next in line for the Blackmere succession if I die without legitimate heirs." Seraphine's face went through a series of changes so rapid they were almost invisible. Confusion to understanding to calculation to fear, but fear lasted only a fraction of a second before something harder replaced it. "How long has he been in Thornhaven?" "I do not know." "The man at the market, Aldrich Marsh, he said he was a teacher from the eastern provinces." Seraphine's voice went flat, controlled. The voice of a woman updating her understanding of reality in real time and not liking the new version. "He has been talking to me for a week. He has spoken with the boys." Cassian went very still. "He spoke with Elias and Lucien. At the harbor, 3 days ago. Elias was showing him the boats." "What did he ask them?" "About school. About their mother. About whether they had family." Seraphine's hands pressed flat against the table surface. Her knuckles whitened. "He asked Lucien if he had ever been told his father's name." Something detonated behind Cassian's eyes, not the calculated fury he deployed in political combat. Something rawer, the unfiltered rage of a man who had just learned that a predator had been circling his children while he sat 20 feet away discussing seabirds. "What did Lucien say?" "Lucien said no, and then he stopped talking to the man entirely." Seraphine's voice cracked for the first time. Not from weakness, from the specific fury that belongs to a mother who has discovered that the defense she built around her children has been breached by someone she allowed through the perimeter. "I let him near my sons, Cassian. I let a stranger talk to them because he seemed harmless, and I was too busy watching you to see the actual danger. This is not your fault. Do not tell me whose fault it is. Tell me what he wants." "He wants the children to not exist. He wants the succession to remain unchanged. He wants 5 years of political investment to retain its value." "And what is he willing to do to achieve that?" Cassian looked at her and for the first time did not attempt to soften the truth. "Anything." Seraphine sat down. Not because she was defeated, because the weight of what that single word contained required a moment of physical recalibration before she could process it and respond. Lucien appeared at her elbow. "Mama?" "The man outside. He is the same man from the harbor." "Yes, darling." "I did not like him at the harbor. He asked too many questions and his eyes did not match his voice." Cassian looked at his older son with an expression that combined recognition with something close to awe. The boy had identified the deception that both adults had missed, not through sophistication, through the uncontaminated instinct that children possess before the world teaches them to override it with politeness. "You were right not to like him," Cassian said quietly. "Trust that feeling, Lucien. It will serve you better than anything anyone tells you." The boy nodded with the grave acceptance of someone filing critical information for permanent storage. That night, after the boys were asleep, Cassian and Seraphine sat across from each other at the cottage table, with a candle between them, and the kind of silence that exists between two people who have run out of room to pretend the situation is manageable. "He will challenge the boy's legitimacy," Cassian said. "He will file a formal petition with the Royal Succession Tribunal. He will present evidence that the children were born outside of marriage to a woman who abandoned her engagement under scandalous circumstances. He will argue that recognition would undermine 6 generations of Raventhorn precedent. Can he win? With enough political support, enough financial backing, and enough noble families willing to side with precedent over paternity, yes, he can win. Then what do we do? I marry you, formally, publicly, before the petition is filed. A legitimate marriage retroactively secures the boy's legal status under the lawful issue doctrine, which grants inheritance rights to children born before marriage if the parents subsequently wed. You researched this. I researched this the day I learned they existed." Seraphine stared at him across the candlelight. The flame threw moving shadows across his face, and for a moment he looked less like a duke and more like what he actually was beneath every layer of authority and control. A man sitting in a small room asking a woman to trust him after giving her every reason not to. "Marriage to you is not a legal strategy, Cassian. It is a life inside the world I left because it nearly destroyed me. I know. A life where my sons will be measured, evaluated, and weaponized by people who see children as instruments of political continuation. I know that too. And you are asking me to walk back into that. I'm asking you to walk into it beside me. Not behind me, not beneath me. Beside me. Because I cannot protect them alone. And you cannot protect them from here. I protected them for 5 years from here. You hid them for 5 years from here. That is not the same thing, and hiding is no longer possible." The distinction landed with the weight of a door closing, not cruelly, not dismissively, with the finality of a man stating a fact that both of them already knew, but only one was willing to say aloud. Seraphine pressed her palms against her eyes. "If I do this," she said slowly, "I need something from you that you have never given anyone. Name it. Honesty, complete and permanent. No managed information, no strategic omissions, no calculating what I can handle. If something threatens our children, I hear about it the moment you do. If something threatens us, I hear about it first. You do not get to decide what I need to know, ever." "Agreed. And if I discover you have withheld anything from me after tonight, I will take those boys so far from Blackmere that your investigators will die of old age before they find us. That is not a negotiation, that is a boundary." Cassian looked at her with the expression of a man who had just been handed terms by someone who operated outside every system of leverage he understood. "Agreed," he said again. "Then we do this. But we do it my way. Not a Raventhorn spectacle, not a political announcement. A marriage. A real one. And those boys walk into Blackmere Castle knowing they are wanted, not deployed." Something moved across Cassian's face that the candlelight could not fully illuminate. Relief. Grief. The complicated aftermath of a man who had been fighting alone for so long that the prospect of shared weight felt more disorienting than the weight itself. "Your way," he said. "My way." Neither of them smiled. This was not a moment that belonged to happiness. It belonged to the narrow space between survival and surrender, where people make the decisions that define the rest of their lives, not because the options are good, but because the alternatives are worse. The candle burned lower. Outside, the sea continued its relentless conversation with the cliffs, and 40 miles south of Blackmere, Malric Thornfield sat in a lamplit study reviewing a document that would arrive at the Royal Succession Tribunal within 72 hours. The petition challenged not only the legitimacy of Cassian's children, but the legal standing of any marriage contracted after a formal succession challenge had been filed. If the petition reached the tribunal before Cassian and Seraphine wed, the lawful issue doctrine would be rendered inapplicable. The marriage would be meaningless. The boys would remain illegitimate, and Malric would inherit Blackmere exactly as planned. He signed the document at 3 a.m. The courier left before dawn, and the only man capable of stopping it was 300 miles away, sitting in a fisherman's cottage, believing he still had time. He did not. The courier reached the Royal Succession Tribunal in 41 hours. Cassian learned about the petition in 43. Hargrove, his steward, sent word through the emergency dispatch system the Raventhorn estate maintained for situations that could not wait for conventional post. A rider arrived in Thornhaven at dawn on a horse foaming at the mouth and trembling from exhaustion. The message was 3 sentences. Formal petition filed by Lord Malric Thornfield challenging succession rights of any unrecognized issue. Tribunal has accepted the filing. Under Section 14 of the Lawful Issue Doctrine, no marriage contracted after the acceptance of a formal challenge carries retroactive legitimacy. Cassian read the message standing in the harbor lane with the morning fog pressing against his shoulders like a physical weight. 3 sentences. That was all it took to collapse the only strategy he had. He stood motionless for nearly a minute while the village woke around him. Fishermen dragged nets toward the water. A woman carried bread from the bakery. Children's voices drifted from the direction of the schoolhouse. The ordinary machinery of a life that existed entirely outside the jurisdiction of succession tribunals and dynastic warfare continued without awareness that anything had changed. But everything had changed. Malric had moved faster than Cassian anticipated because Cassian had committed the single error he never permitted in political warfare. He had assumed his opponent would operate within the boundaries of family loyalty. He had given Malric the courtesy of a warning and expected that warning to purchase time. Instead, the warning had functioned as a starting gun, and Malric had sprinted while Cassian stood in a cottage discussing marriage terms by candlelight. The miscalculation tasted like iron in his mouth. He crossed the village to the cottage at a pace that made 2 fishermen step off the lane to let him pass. Not because he gestured at them, because the thing moving through the fog toward them wore the expression of a man who had just discovered the distance between control and catastrophe was shorter than he believed, and something about that expression triggered the survival instinct of every person in its path. Seraphine was dressing the boys for school when Cassian came through the door without knocking. She saw his face and immediately sent Lucien and Elias to the schoolhouse with instructions to tell her assistant that morning lessons would begin without her. The boys left reluctantly. Lucien looked back twice. When they were gone, Seraphine closed the door and turned to face the man standing in her kitchen with a dispatch crumpled in his fist. How bad? The petition has been filed and accepted. Section 14 is now in effect. Marriage no longer resolves the legitimacy question. What does that mean in language that does not require a law degree? It means Malric got there first. The tribunal will hear his challenge before we can establish legal parentage through marriage. If the tribunal rules in his favor, the boys remain illegitimate regardless of what happens afterward. Blackmere passes to Malric. Our sons inherit nothing. Seraphine absorbed this the way she absorbed every blow that had landed over the past 5 years. Not by collapsing, by going still long enough to locate the structural weakness in the damage and determine whether the rest of the building could still stand. What options remain? Direct recognition. I petition the tribunal separately for formal acknowledgement of paternity independent of marriage. The standard requires physical evidence, sworn testimony, and corroborating documentation. The timeline is brutal. 6 weeks minimum before a hearing is scheduled. 3 months before a ruling is issued. And during those 3 months, Malric does what? Everything. He challenges every piece of evidence. He attacks your reputation publicly. He presents the circumstances of your disappearance as proof of instability. He argues that a woman who fled her own engagement and concealed children from their father for 5 years lacks the credibility required for her testimony to carry legal weight. He argues that I am unfit. He argues that your choices make the paternity claim unreliable. Different legal framing, same objective. Seraphine's jaw tightened so hard the tendons in her neck became visible. So the man who deceived me for a week, who sat outside my cottage and talked to my children under a false name, who has been manufacturing lies about his identity since he arrived in this village. That man will stand before a tribunal and question my credibility. Yes. And the legal system permits this. The legal system was designed by men like Malric for situations exactly like this. It does not protect mothers. It protects property. The admission cost Cassian something. Seraphine could see it in the way his shoulders adjusted, a fractional shift that betrayed the weight of acknowledging a system he had benefited from his entire life was now the instrument being used against his own children. "There is another option," Cassian said. "Tell me." "I go back to Blackmere immediately. I do not wait for the tribunal timeline. I convene an emergency session of the Raventhorn Family Council, which has independent authority over internal succession matters that predates parliamentary jurisdiction. If the family council recognizes the boys before the tribunal issues its ruling, Malric's petition becomes legally subordinate. A family council, meaning your relatives decide. Meaning the 5 senior members of the Raventhorn bloodline vote on whether to accept my sons into the lineage. 3 votes in favor establishes recognition, and Malric is one of those 5 members. Yes. So you need 3 of the remaining 4. I need 3 people who have spent the last 5 years being told they would benefit from Malric's eventual ascension to reverse their position based on the word of a duke who vanished without explanation and returned with 2 children nobody knew existed. Seraphine stared at him. "You are describing the impossible. I am describing the only path left. Cassian, listen to yourself. You're going to walk into a room full of people who have been cultivated by your enemy for half a decade and ask them to abandon their investments based on what? Your word? Your authority? The sheer gravitational pull of being a Raventhorn? Based on the truth. The truth has not been particularly useful to either of us so far." He flinched, barely. A man trained since childhood to absorb impact without visible reaction, showing damage at the edges. "I know what I am asking. I know the odds. I know that Malric has spent 5 years building alliances I should have been monitoring and was not because I was too consumed with finding you to notice my own house being undermined. I know all of that. Then why do you think this can work?" Cassian looked at her with an expression stripped of every defense he normally carried. Not the Duke, not the strategist. The man underneath all of it, standing in a kitchen that smelled like bread and salt air, asking himself the same question she had just asked him, and arriving at an answer that had nothing to do with power. "Because I have spent my entire life winning fights through leverage, through intimidation, through the certainty that I had more resources than whoever stood against me, and every one of those victories felt like nothing. Empty rooms full of defeated people who hated me quietly while pretending to comply." He paused. "This is the first time I have ever fought for something that actually matters. And I would rather lose fighting for my sons than win another meaningless battle for a dynasty that has never given me anything except a title and an empty castle." The cottage went quiet except for the wind against the windows and the distant sound of waves that never stopped. Seraphine crossed the room. She stood in front of him close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his chest through the fabric of his coat. She reached up and placed her hand flat against the center of his sternum, pressing hard enough to feel his heartbeat hammering beneath her palm. "Then go," she said. "Fight for them. But come back, Cassian. Come back whole." He covered her hand with his own and held it there for 3 heartbeats. Then he was gone. Cassian's carriage left Thornhaven within the hour. He traveled without rest, changing horses at relay stations along the northern road, pushing through the night while the temperature dropped and frost formed on the carriage windows. He arrived at Blackmere Castle 31 hours later looking like a man who had not slept in 2 days because he had not slept in 2 days. Hargrove met him at the gates with a face that communicated the severity of the situation more efficiently than any briefing could. "How many council members has Malric contacted?" "All 4, Your Grace. Lady Ashworth and Lord Pemberton visited his estate last week. Lord Greaves received correspondence 3 days ago. Lady Whitmore has not responded to either party." Whitmore is the swing vote. Lady Whitmore is 83 years old and has not left her estate in 4 years. She despises politics, distrusts all of her relatives equally, and has stated repeatedly that she intends to outlive every member of the Raventhorn bloodline purely out of spite. Get me a meeting with her. Your Grace, Lady Whitmore has refused every request for audience since I did not ask for a status report on her social calendar. I asked you to get me a meeting. Use whatever channel works. Bribery. Flattery. Tell her I will crawl to her front door on my hands and knees if that is what it takes. I do not care. Get me in front of her before Malric does. Hargrove had served 3 generations of Raventhorns and had witnessed behaviors ranging from strategic brilliance to catastrophic stubbornness. But he had never seen this particular combination before. Desperation wearing the clothes of authority, a man operating at the absolute limit of his emotional capacity while maintaining just enough structural composure to issue functional commands. I will arrange it, Your Grace. Today, Hargrove. Today. While Hargrove worked channels that involved a combination of carefully worded letters and what he would later describe as creative persuasion, Cassian dealt with Ashworth and Pemberton directly. Lady Ashworth received him in her morning room with the brittle courtesy of a woman who had already committed to a position but was too well-bred to admit it before dessert. She was 61. Sharp. A survivor of 4 decades of aristocratic politics who understood leverage the way surgeons understood anatomy. You look terrible, Cassian. I have not slept in 2 days. That is not what I mean. You look like a man carrying something heavy. I have seen that expression before, usually on men who come to ask me for things they know I should not give them. I am not here to negotiate. Everyone who sits in that chair is here to negotiate. The only question is whether they are honest enough to admit it. Cassian leaned forward. His elbows rested on his knees. His hands hung between them, and she noticed they were not steady. I have 2 sons. They are 4 years old. They live in a fishing village with their mother, who is the woman I was engaged to marry 5 years ago. Malric has filed a challenge against their legitimacy because their existence threatens his claim to Blackmere. I'm asking the family council to recognize them before the tribunal rules. You are asking me to side against the man I have spent 3 years supporting as your presumptive heir. I'm asking you to look at the situation and decide whether Malric Thornfield is the man you want controlling the most powerful duchy in the Northern Territories. Malric is predictable. Predictability has value. Malric deceived a woman under a false identity and interrogated my 4-year-old son for information in a fishing village harbor. That is not predictable. That is dangerous. Ashworth studied him for a long time. You never told anyone about these children. I did not know they existed until 3 weeks ago. And their mother, the woman who vanished, she chose to keep them hidden from you. She chose to protect them from a world she believed would consume them. I am not certain she was wrong. That is an unusual admission from a Raventhorn. I have been making unusual admissions recently. It appears fatherhood has compromised my ability to maintain comfortable illusions. Something shifted in Ashworth's expression. Not warmth, not sympathy. Something harder and more useful. Recalculation. The look of a woman reassessing the variables in an equation she thought she had already solved. I will not commit to a vote today, she said, but I will tell you this. Malric visited me last week and spent 90 minutes explaining why your children should not exist. He was thorough. He was persuasive. He was completely convincing. And at no point during those 90 minutes did he express a single sentiment about those boys that was not transactional. She paused. You have been here 4 minutes, and you have not once mentioned the political implications. You have only spoken about your sons. That may be strategic. It may be genuine. I have not yet decided which. But the distinction matters to me. It should. It is the only distinction that matters in any of this. Cassian left Ashworth without a commitment, but with something potentially more valuable. Doubt. He had planted doubt in the foundation of Malric's coalition, and doubt was the most corrosive substance in political architecture. Pemberton was harder. A man of 68 who had built his entire career on conservative adherence to precedent and tradition. He listened to Cassian's case with the patience of a judge who had already written his verdict and was simply allowing the defendant to finish speaking for procedural reasons. Legitimacy through recognition requires a preponderance of evidence, Cassian. You are asking this council to accept the word of a woman who fled under questionable circumstances and concealed these children deliberately. I'm asking this council to accept the word of their duke. Your word is not in question. Your judgment is. 5 years ago, you failed to secure your own succession. You allowed your intended bride to disappear without explanation. You permitted your estate to drift toward a succession crisis through neglect. And now you arrive demanding emergency action based on discoveries made in a fishing village 300 miles from proper authority. My sons do not become less mine because of where they were born. The law disagrees. Then the law is wrong, and I am here to correct it. Pemberton removed his spectacles and cleaned them with a cloth for an unnecessarily long time. Lord Thornfield's petition carries considerable legal weight. The tribunal will likely rule in his favor. Voting against that outcome exposes every council member to political retaliation from a man who has demonstrated both the resources and the willingness to pursue it. And voting with him makes every council member complicit in stripping 2 children of their birthright to preserve one man's ambition. Birthright is established by law, not by blood alone. Birthright is established by the willingness of a family to claim its own. That is what I am doing. I am claiming my sons. Before this council, before the tribunal, before anyone who requires it, and I am asking the people who share my name to stand beside me while I do it. Pemberton said nothing for a long time. Then he put his spectacles back on and said, I will consider your position. That is all I can offer. Cassian left knowing that consideration from Pemberton was not a commitment, but it was not a refusal, and in political warfare the space between those 2 states was where battles were won. Greaves fell in line within hours. A younger man, 44, who owed his position to Cassian's direct patronage and understood that loyalty to Malric meant disloyalty to the Duke who had made his career possible. His vote was not courage, it was self-preservation calculated correctly. Cassian accepted it without sentiment because sentiment was a luxury the timeline did not permit. 1 vote secured, 2 needed. Everything rested on Whitmore. Hargrove arranged the meeting for the following afternoon at Lady Whitmore's estate, a crumbling stone manor 30 miles east of Blackmere that looked like it had been arguing with the weather for 2 centuries and losing gradually. The gardens were overgrown, the gates were rusted. A single elderly servant admitted Cassian through a side entrance and led him down a corridor lined with portraits of Raventhorn ancestors, whose painted eyes seemed to follow him with varying degrees of disapproval. Lady Elspeth Whitmore sat in a high-backed chair beside a fire that was burning hot enough to redden the air. She was small, skeletal. Her white hair was pulled back severely, and her eyes, still Raventhorn gray at 83, carried the particular sharpness of someone who had watched 6 decades of family politics and found every participant disappointing. "Sit down," she said, "and do not waste my time with pleasantries. Malric was here yesterday. He wasted 40 minutes on pleasantries, and I nearly died of boredom, which at my age is a genuine medical risk." Cassian sat. "You want my vote?" "Yes." "Why should I give it to you?" "Because I am asking for the right thing." "The right thing? How refreshing." Every Raventhorn who has ever sat in that chair told me they were asking for the right thing. Your grandfather asked me for the right thing when he wanted to disinherit your uncle. Your father asked me for the right thing when he wanted to consolidate the northern trade routes. The right thing, in Raventhorn vocabulary, has always meant the convenient thing dressed in better language. I have 2 sons. They are 4 years old. They exist. They carry Raventhorn blood. Malric wants to erase them from the family record to protect his own inheritance. I want the council to recognize them so they can grow up knowing who they are. That is the entirety of my argument. Whitmore studied him the way a jeweler studies a stone, looking for flaws. Malric told me the mother is unstable, that she abandoned you, that she hid these children deliberately for years. She left because she believed I had betrayed her with her own sister. She hid the children because she believed the world I inhabit would destroy them. She was operating on incomplete information, but her instinct to protect them was not unstable. It was the sanest decision anyone in this family has made in 30 years. You are defending the woman who kept your sons from you. I am describing her accurately. Whitmore's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. That is either remarkable honesty or remarkable strategy. I have not decided which. Lady Ashworth said the same thing. Ashworth is a cautious woman. I am not. I am 83 years old, and I have watched this family eat itself alive for 6 decades. I have watched Raventhorn scheme and manipulate and destroy each other over property, power, and pride. I have buried more of my relatives than I care to count, and every single one of them died believing they were the most important person in the room. She leaned forward. The fire threw shadows across her face that made her look ancient and formidable simultaneously. Tell me about the boys. Cassian's expression changed. The political armor he had been wearing through every meeting that day shifted, and something underneath it became visible. Not vulnerability exactly, something more dangerous. The unprotected center of a man who had discovered the one subject he could not discuss strategically. Lucien is the older twin. He reads constantly. He organizes his books by category and becomes genuinely angry when anyone disrupts the order. He watches people with a patience that should not be possible at his age, and he does not trust easily. When he looks at you, you feel evaluated. Cassian paused. Elias is terrified of nothing. He talks to strangers. He climbs things. He once sailed a fishing boat into the harbor alone before anyone could stop him. He laughs louder than any child I have ever heard, and he approaches every new situation as though it was designed specifically for his entertainment. Another pause. Lucien shook my hand the first time we met, a handshake, from a 4-year-old, like he was conducting a formal introduction and wanted to establish terms. Whitmore said nothing for a long time. The fire cracked. Wind pressed against the old windows. Malric spent 40 minutes telling me why these children should be legally excluded from the Raventhorn bloodline, she said finally. He presented documents, legal precedents, political consequences. It was the most thoroughly prepared argument I have heard in 20 years. She paused. He never once mentioned their names. The silence that followed contained the weight of a decision being made behind eyes that had watched enough of the world to know the difference between men who fought for power and men who fought for something that had changed them so fundamentally they could not go back to what they were before. Summon the council, Whitmore said. You will have your vote. Cassian exhaled. Not relief. Not yet. Because having the vote scheduled and having the vote won were separated by the most dangerous distance in political warfare, the space between commitment and execution where everything could still collapse. He stood. Lady Whitmore, do not thank me. I despise gratitude. It is the most manipulative of the social courtesies. Just bring those boys to Blackmere alive and whole, and prove to me that at least one Raventhorn in 6 generations is capable of building something instead of destroying it. The council was convened for the following morning. 9 hours. 9 hours between this current moment and the vote that would determine whether Lucien and Elias Raventhorn existed legally or remained ghosts in a fishing village, unnamed and unclaimed by the family whose blood ran through them. Cassian returned to Blackmere Castle and spent those 9 hours preparing documents, reviewing legal precedents, and sitting alone in his study staring at a maritime atlas he had purchased in the village bookshop before leaving Thornhaven. The same type Lucien had been reading. He opened it to the page showing fathom markings and depth measurements and traced the symbols with one finger while the fire burned low and the castle settled into the heavy silence of a structure built to withstand siege. At dawn, Hargrove entered the study with a message that had arrived by overnight courier. Cassian opened it. It was from Seraphine. 2 words. We trust you. He folded the message precisely, placed it in the inside pocket of his coat, directly over his heart, with the deliberate care of a man handling something irreplaceable. Then the Duke of Blackmere walked into the council chamber to fight the last battle of his life. The 5 chairs of the Raventhorn family council were arranged in a semicircle inside the great hall of Blackmere Castle. Greaves sat on the far left, his vote secured. Ashworth sat beside him, her expression unreadable. Pemberton occupied the center chair with the rigid posture of a man determined to appear impartial. Whitmore sat to his right, small and ancient, and radiating the particular energy of someone who had already made a decision and was waiting for the formalities to justify it. Malric sat in the 5th chair. He looked at Cassian with the composed hostility of a man who understood that this room was the last battlefield, and one of them would not leave it intact. Cassian stood before the council. He did not bring lawyers. He did not bring advisors. He did not bring the elaborate documentation he had spent the night preparing. He brought the maritime atlas, and he opened his mouth to speak just as the great hall doors swung open behind him with a sound that echoed off stone walls built 400 years ago to withstand cannon fire. Every head in the room turned. Seraphine stood in the doorway. Lucienne held her left hand. Elias held her right. Two small boys with storm-gray raven-thorn eyes looked into the great hall of Blackmere Castle for the first time in their lives. And the room that had witnessed 6 generations of political warfare went silent in a way it had never been silent before. Malric's face went white, and the battle for Blackmere began. Seraphine walked into the great hall of Blackmere Castle the way she had once walked out of it, without permission, without hesitation, without looking at anyone in the room except the man standing at its center. But this time she was not alone. Lucien's hand gripped hers with the controlled tension of a boy who understood he was entering somewhere important without fully understanding why. His gray eyes moved across the vaulted ceiling, the stone columns, the enormous raven-thorn crest carved above the council dais, absorbing details with the systematic patience of a child who cataloged the world before deciding whether to trust it. Elias held her other hand for approximately 4 seconds before releasing it entirely. He walked 3 steps ahead of his mother with the unearned confidence of someone who believed every room in the world had been built specifically for him to explore. His boots, still carrying dried mud from the Thornhaven harbor, left small prints on stone floors that had been polished by servants for 4 centuries. The council members stared, not at Seraphine, not at Cassie Anne, at the boys. Because legal arguments and political strategies and succession petitions existed in the realm of abstraction, and abstractions could be debated endlessly by reasonable people sitting in comfortable chairs. But 2 living children standing in a stone hall with their father's eyes set in their small faces existed in the realm of the undeniable, and the undeniable had a weight that no legal framework could fully contain. Malric recovered first. His composure reassembled with the speed of a man who had trained himself to absorb shock the way armor absorbs impact, by distributing the force across a surface designed to prevent penetration. "This is a formal council proceeding," he said, his voice carrying the measured disapproval of someone citing procedure to regain control. "The presence of unrecognized individuals is irregular, and these are not unrecognized individuals." Cassian's voice cut through the hall with a clarity that bounced off 400-year-old stone. "These are Lucienne and Elias Raventhorn. They are my sons. They are standing in their ancestral home, and the only irregular presence in this room is the man attempting to erase them from it." Malric's jaw tightened, a small movement, the kind that revealed more than a speech because it was involuntary, the body betraying the strain the face was designed to conceal. "Cassian, the emotional theater of producing children at a council hearing does not change the legal. I did not produce them. Their mother brought them. She traveled 300 miles through the night because she decided that 2 boys who carry Raventhorn blood deserve to stand inside Raventhorn walls while their future is being decided by people who have never met them." Cassian turned to the council. "You have read Malric's petition. You have reviewed his legal arguments. You have been presented with precedents, documentation, and political analysis designed to demonstrate why these children should not exist in the eyes of this family. All of it is technically competent. All of it follows the letter of succession law. And none of it changes the fact that my sons are standing in this room right now with the same eyes that have looked out from every Raventhorn portrait hanging in this castle for 6 generations." He paused. "I am not asking you to break precedent. I am asking you to look at them." The hall went silent. Elias, utterly unaware of the political significance of the moment, had wandered toward the base of a stone column and was running his fingers along the carved surface with the intense fascination of a child who had discovered texture more interesting than conversation. Lucien remained beside his mother, watching the council with the unblinking focus of someone memorizing faces for future reference. Lady Whitmore spoke from her chair with a voice that crackled like dry wood. "The boy, the quiet one. Come here." Lucien looked at Seraphine. She nodded once. He crossed the hall with measured steps, stopping 3 feet from Whitmore's chair. Not too close. Not too far. The precise distance of someone who understood boundaries without being taught them. Whitmore leaned forward and studied him with the same gray eyes, 6 decades older and infinitely more weathered, set in a face that had outlived every expectation placed upon it. "What is your name?" "Lucien." "Do you know where you are, Lucy?" "A castle. It belongs to my father." The simplicity of the statement landed in the hall like a stone dropped into still water, not because it was dramatic, because it was true, spoken by someone too young to understand that truth in this room was a radical act. Whitmore looked at the council. "I have heard enough." Malric stood from his chair. The movement was sharp, controlled, the gesture of a man who felt the ground shifting beneath him and refused to let his footing adjust without a fight. This is not a sentimentality contest. The legal question before this council is specific. Are these children entitled to recognition under Raventhorn succession law, given the circumstances of their birth, their concealment, and the absence of formal marriage between their parents? Bringing them here does not answer that question. It evades it. "You are correct that the question is legal," Lady Ashworth said from her seat, speaking for the first time since the proceedings began. "But the answer is not. The answer is whether this family chooses to claim its own blood or discard it for convenience. That is not a legal question. That is a question about what kind of family we are. We are a family that has survived for 6 generations because we followed the rules we established," Malric fired back. "Not because we abandoned them whenever the current Duke presented a compelling emotional display." Cassian stepped forward. "You want to discuss rules? Let us discuss rules." His voice dropped into the register that courtrooms associated with incoming destruction. Raventhorn Family Charter, Article 7, Section 3. Direct paternal acknowledgement before the family council constitutes legal recognition independent of marital status, if supported by a majority vote of sitting members. The provision was established in 1643 by Marcus Raventhorn to legitimize his son born during the Continental Wars while he was unable to return home for formal marriage. It has never been repealed. It has never been amended. And it applies to this situation with a precision that suggests Marcus Raventhorn anticipated exactly this kind of dispute 3 centuries before it occurred. Malric's face went through a series of rapid calculations visible only to someone watching closely. The provision was real. He knew it was real. But he had not expected Cassian to find it, because the record was buried in archival documents that had not been reviewed in over a century. That provision is antiquated, and that provision is law. Raventhorn law, the same body of law your petition relies upon. You do not get to invoke our family charter when it serves your interests and dismiss it when it does not. The circumstances are entirely different. Marcus Raventhorn was at war. You were at a fishing village. I was at war. Cassian's voice changed. Something in it broke open. Not weakness, but the sound of a man finally allowing the full weight of what he had endured to become audible. I have been at war for 5 years, not with armies, not with foreign powers, with the silence left behind by a woman I failed and children I did not know existed, and a life I built that turned out to be empty at its center. You want to compare my situation to Marcus Raventhorn at the Continental Front? Go ahead. The geography is different. The stakes are not. Pemberton, who had maintained judicial silence throughout the proceeding, removed his spectacles. I would like to hear from the mother. Every eye in the room turned to Seraphine. She stood near the entrance with her hand resting on Lucien's shoulder. The boy had returned to her side after his exchange with Whitmore, and her fingers rested lightly against him, not gripping, not pulling, simply maintaining contact the way a navigator maintains contact with a compass. She walked to the center of the hall. I will not apologize for what I did, she said. Her voice carried across stone acoustics designed to amplify authority, and it turned out authority was not the exclusive property of dukes. I left this castle 5 years ago because I believed the man I was going to marry had betrayed me with my sister. I was wrong about what I saw. I was not wrong about the world I was entering, a world where women are traded between families like property, where marriages are financial instruments, where my own father sold me to settle his debts and no one involved considered informing me. She let that settle. I kept my sons hidden because I knew what would happen if they were found. They would become instruments, tools, leverage in exactly the kind of proceeding happening in this room right now. Their value would be measured in succession points and political capital. Their childhood would be consumed by the machinery of aristocratic inheritance, and I refused to allow that. She looked at Malric directly. You came to my village under a false name. You sat outside my home. You spoke to my children. You asked my 4-year-old son if he knew his father's name. You did this while pretending to be a harmless stranger, and you did it because you needed to assess the threat my boys posed to your ambition before deciding how to eliminate them. Malric opened his mouth. I am not finished. The hall went absolutely still. Servants standing along the walls stopped breathing. Council members sat motionless. Even Elias, who had been examining the carved column base with the dedication of a junior archaeologist, went quiet. I have spent 5 years protecting these children from the world you represent, a world where human beings are assets to be managed and threats to be neutralized. I came here today not because I trust this family, not because I trust this process, and not because I believe any council vote can guarantee my son's safety. I came because their father asked me to, and because he has spent the last 3 weeks proving to me that he is capable of being something more than what this family made him. She looked at Cassian. That is not a small thing. Changing the fundamental pattern of how you operate in the world is not a small thing. It is the hardest thing a person can do, and most people never manage it. He managed it in a fisherman's cottage while a 4-year-old taught him about imaginary sea monsters. And if this family cannot recognize that kind of transformation, then this family does not deserve the loyalty of the man standing in front of you, let alone the futures of 2 boys who have done nothing except exist. She stepped back. The silence that followed was not the silence of indecision. It was the silence of a room full of people recalibrating their understanding of the situation based on information that could not be processed quickly because it operated at a depth that political analysis could not reach. Whitmore spoke. Call the vote. Pemberton replaced his spectacles, straightened in his chair. The question before this council is whether to formally recognize Lucian and Elias, sons of Duke Cassian Raventhorn, as legitimate heirs to the Blackmere succession under Article 7, Section 3 of the Raventhorn Family Charter. Council members will vote by voice. Lord Greaves. In favor? Lady Ashworth. A pause. Ashworth looked at Cassian, then at the boys, then at Malric. The pause lasted long enough that the air in the room compressed. In favor. 2 votes. 1 more needed. Lady Whitmore. In favor. And I would like it noted for the record that this is the first sensible decision this family has made since I was 40. 3 votes. Majority achieved. Pemberton turned to Malric. Malric sat in his chair with the posture of a man watching the architecture he had spent 5 years constructing collapse floor by floor in real time. His face maintained its composure. His hands, folded in his lap, did not tremble. But something behind his eyes had gone dark. The specific darkness of a gambler watching the last card turn and understanding that the mathematics of his position had become terminal. Lord Thornfield. Opposed. The motion carries 3-1 with 1 abstention from the chair. The council formally recognizes Lucian and Elias Raventhorn as legitimate heirs to the Blackmere Duchy. The recognition supersedes all pending tribunal challenges. This decision is final and binding under Raventhorn Family Charter. Pemberton set down his pen. Council is adjourned. Malric stood. He looked at Cassian across the hall with an expression that contained no warmth, no concession, and no pretense of familial loyalty. You have won this room. You have not won the war. There is no war, Malric. There was a question about whether my sons belong to this family. The question has been answered. What happens next is up to you. What happens next is that I spend every resource available to me challenging this decision through parliamentary channels, public opinion, and whatever legal mechanism. Or, Cassian stepped toward him, not aggressively. With the deliberate calm of a man who had discovered that the most dangerous weapon in his arsenal was not force, but the willingness to extend something his opponent did not expect. You accept the outcome. You retain your position in the family. You maintain your estates, your alliances, your political career. You remain a Raventhorn in good standing, with every privilege that entails. And you walk out of this hall with the understanding that I am offering you the one thing I have never offered anyone who challenged me, which is the chance to stop before I have to destroy you. Malric stared at him. The offer was genuine. That was the part Malric had not anticipated. Not a strategic feint, not a negotiating tactic. A real offer extended by a man who had learned something in a fishing village that Blackmere Castle had never taught him. That victory without mercy was just another form of defeat wearing a better suit. That the version of power worth having was the kind that could afford to leave an enemy standing because it was strong enough not to require total annihilation. Malric's jaw worked. The room waited. "I will withdraw the petition," he said finally. His voice was flat, controlled. The voice of a man swallowing something that tasted like ground glass and refusing to let anyone see him choke. "But I want it understood that I am not conceding the principle. I am conceding the reality. The reality is sufficient." Malric walked out of the great hall without looking at anyone. The doors closed behind him with a sound that echoed through stone corridors built to withstand centuries. Elias broke the silence by sneezing so loudly that Lady Whitmore actually flinched, which, given that the woman had not visibly reacted to anything since approximately 1987, was itself a historic event. "I like this castle," Elias announced to no one in particular. "It echoes." Lucian looked at Cassian. "Is this our home now?" Cassian knelt, one knee on the stone floor of the great hall where 6 generations of Raventhorns had conducted the business of dynasty. His coat spread around him, his face level with his son's. "This is your home. It has always been your home. You just had not arrived yet." Lucian considered this with characteristic gravity. "It needs more books." "Then we will fill it with books." Lucian nodded. The transaction was complete. Terms had been established and accepted. He turned to examine the nearest bookshelf with the focused determination of someone beginning a long-term inventory project. Cassian stood and looked at Seraphine. She was standing in the center of the great hall with her arms crossed and her eyes bright with something she was clearly fighting to control. Not tears. Seraphine did not cry in public and had no intention of starting in the ancestral seat of the family she had spent 5 years running from. But whatever lived behind her expression was powerful enough to reshape the way she held her body, a loosening of the defensive posture she had maintained since the moment she walked through the door. He crossed the hall to her. "You came. I told you we trust you. You brought the boys into a succession hearing. You brought a maritime atlas to a succession hearing. I thought I would raise the stakes." Something that was not quite a smile, and not quite relief, and not quite the beginning of everything that would come after, crossed Cassian's face. It was the expression of a man standing on the other side of the worst fight of his life, realizing that he was still standing, and that the woman beside him was still beside him, and that the 2 children exploring his ancestral castle with muddy boots and zero reverence for aristocratic dignity were his, actually his, legally and permanently and in every way that mattered. "Seraphine, Cassian, marry me, not for the succession, not for the legal protection, not because the situation demands it." "Why then?" "Because I spent 5 years searching for you and 3 weeks sitting on a cottage floor, and both of those things taught me the same lesson, and I am tired of pretending I have not learned it." "What lesson?" "That the man I was before you is not a man worth being, and the man I became while looking for you is not a man who survives without you." Seraphine unfolded her arms. She reached up and placed her hand flat against his chest the same way she had done in the cottage, over his heart, pressing hard enough to feel the rhythm beneath. "Ask me properly. Will you marry me?" "Yes, but we are doing it by the sea, in Thornhaven, where the boys learn to walk and I learn to survive, and no one in attendance will be wearing anything that costs more than a fishing boat." "Agreed. And Elias is going to wear his muddy boots." "I would expect nothing less." They married on a Tuesday, not because Tuesday held any particular significance, but because Seraphine refused to wait for a fashionable weekend and Cassian had learned that arguing with her about scheduling was a battle he would lose with the same certainty as gravity. The ceremony took place in the stone chapel on the Thornhaven cliff path, the one with the blue wooden door and the windows warped by a century of salt air. The building was small enough that the guest list was limited by physics rather than politics, which suited both of them perfectly. Fishermen sat beside the few aristocratic allies who had earned their presence through loyalty rather than rank. Mrs. Corrigan, who had watched the boys every morning for 2 years without once asking about their father, sat in the front row and cried openly. Hargrove attended. He stood at the back of the chapel in his formal steward's attire, looking profoundly uncomfortable in a building that smelled like the ocean and completely at peace for the first time in 5 years. Lucien stood beside his mother during the vows. He held the rings with the solemnity of someone entrusted with a task of historic importance, and was quietly furious when Elias attempted to examine them prematurely. Elias stood beside his father. He wore his muddy boots as promised and spent most of the ceremony looking out the chapel window at a seagull perched on the cliff wall, providing whispered commentary on its behavior that Cassian pretended not to hear and absolutely heard. Cassian kept one hand against the small of Seraphine's back throughout the service. Not possessive, not controlling. Present. The gesture of a man who had traveled a great distance to stand in this exact spot and intended to remember the feeling of being there for the rest of his life. When the vows were finished, Seraphine looked at him with an expression that contained 5 years of anger and 3 weeks of cautious trust, and the particular clarity that belongs to someone who has made a decision with full awareness of its risks and no intention of looking backward. "If you ever give me a reason to disappear again," she said quietly, "I will not leave a ring on the table this time. I will take the table." Understood. And the castle? Also understood. Good. The kingdom adjusted, not quickly, not gracefully. The aristocracy processed the Raventhorn situation the way it processed all disruptions to established order, with gossip, resistance, and eventual reluctant acceptance once it became clear that opposing the Duke on this particular subject carried consequences that no reasonable person wanted to experience. Malric withdrew from public life for several months. He eventually resurfaced in a diminished capacity, his political network intact, but his influence permanently reduced. He and Cassian maintained a relationship that could be described as civil in the way that two nations maintaining a border treaty could be described as friendly. Functional. Cautious. Built on the understanding that peace was preferable to war for reasons of mutual exhaustion, if nothing else. Cassian changed Blackmere, not by dismantling its power, by redirecting it. Schools were funded across the Northern Territories, modeled on the small stone building where Seraphine had taught children to read beside the sea. Harbor villages received protection from corrupt trade officials who had operated without oversight for decades. The duchy's resources, which had historically been deployed to consolidate Raventhorn dominance, began flowing toward infrastructure that served people who would never set foot inside a castle. Seraphine drove most of it. She operated with the practical efficiency of a woman who had managed a household on fishing village wages and found aristocratic budgets almost comically excessive by comparison. She sat in meetings with trade ministers and parliamentary liaisons and spoke with the directness of someone who had no patience for political performance and even less patience for people who confuse complexity with competence. The court found her terrifying. Cassian found her magnificent. The boys grew. Lucien filled Blackmere's library with books acquired through a combination of legitimate purchases and an informal network of booksellers across 3 provinces who had been charmed into providing first editions at reduced prices by a boy whose negotiation skills surpassed most adults by the age of 6. He read history and navigation and cartography and occasionally fiction, though he evaluated fictional narratives with the critical rigor of a literary scholar and once dismissed an adventure novel as geographically implausible after cross-referencing its descriptions with his Atlas collection. Elias climbed everything in Blackmere Castle that could be climbed and several things that could not. He befriended every servant, every stable hand, every visiting dignitary, and a stray dog that appeared in the courtyard one winter and was named Captain Brennan in honor of the tallest man in Thornhaven. He talked constantly. He laughed at volumes that rattled window panes. He approached the world with the fundamental conviction that it was an interesting place full of interesting people, and the only appropriate response was enthusiastic engagement. Cassian watched his sons grow the way a man watches the sea from a cliff he once nearly fell from. With awe, with caution, with the persistent low-grade terror of someone who understands how close he came to losing everything and cannot entirely stop calculating the distance. But the terror softened over time. Not because the world became safer, because he learned that the point of building something worth protecting was not to eliminate the possibility of loss, but to accept it, to carry the weight of vulnerability as the cost of having something real, and to wake up every morning choosing to remain present inside a life that could be damaged precisely because it mattered. On quiet evenings, when the political machinery of the duchy had been shut down for the day and the castle settled into the particular silence of a large stone structure cooling in the dark, Cassian could sometimes be found sitting on the floor of the great hall. Not the study, not the formal chambers, the great hall. The same floor where his sons had stood during the council vote that changed the shape of the Raventhorn legacy. Lucien would be reading beside the fire with his books arranged in precise order around him like a defensive perimeter. Elias would be somewhere nearby, usually in motion, usually narrating an imaginary scenario involving sea creatures of impossible dimensions at a volume that suggested he believed the story required the same acoustics as the council proceedings. Seraphine would be in the chair nearest the fire, reviewing correspondence or reading or simply watching the three of them with an expression that the servants had learned to recognize and never interrupt. Cassian would sit on the floor with his back against the stone base of the column Elias had examined on his first day in the castle. He would watch his sons. He would watch their mother. He would listen to the fire and the wind and the distant sound of the sea that reached Blackmere on clear nights when the air moved south. And he would think about the man who had stood in this hall for 30 years, believing that power was the only architecture that mattered. The man who had ruled through fear because fear was efficient. The man who had mistaken control for strength and dominance for safety and the absence of vulnerability for the presence of peace. That man had been demolished, not by an enemy, not by a political rival, not by the elaborate mechanisms of aristocratic warfare, by a woman who walked away without a word, by two boys with storm-gray eyes and muddy boots, by the discovery that the most terrifying thing a powerful man can do is not crush his opponents, but kneel on a cottage floor and admit he has been building the wrong thing his entire life. The servants of Blackmere Castle never spoke about those quiet evenings, but they remembered them, because the great hall where 6 generations of Raventhorns had conducted the business of empire, where alliances had been forged and enemies destroyed, and the cold machinery of dynastic power had operated without interruption for 400 years, that hall sounded different now. It sounded like 2 boys arguing about sea monsters while their father sat on the floor and their mother watched from beside the fire, and the castle itself seemed to settle more comfortably on its foundations, as though it had been waiting a very long time for someone to finally use it for something worth building. Outside, the northern sea crashed against the cliffs of Blackmere with the same relentless rhythm it had maintained for 10,000 years. It did not care about dukes or dynasties or the complicated machinery of human inheritance, but if the sea could have witnessed what happened inside those walls, it might have recognized something familiar. The patient, unglamorous, stubbornly persistent work of rebuilding, the same thing the tide does every single day. Coming back, coming back, coming back, until the shape of the shore is something new.